Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm not personally in search of publicity, but I'm in search of the public in the city. And so my big idea is about the public realm. And I have a very simple definition of it, which I borrow from the sociologist Richard Sennett, who describes the public realm as places where strangers meet. So we're basically talking about any space other than private space, other than the space that we occupy in our personal, private, familial relations. So I'm thinking of things like streets and parks and art galleries, museums, stadia, and so on. The kind of characteristics of these public spaces are that they're open, they're accessible, you don't have a particular requirement. Nobody's going to check that you are wearing a suit to get in, and they are not excluding, they're not socially excluding. Now, my argument is that these places in the modern 21st century city are somewhat under threat. And they're under threat for three reasons. First of all, there's the whole process of privatization. And that means that most of us spend a lot more time these days in our cars, right? So we're in little bubbles cut off from each other. Or we live in gated communities, or we are consumers that while away our days in shopping malls, which are all privatized kind of spaces. A second threat comes from marketization. The fact that an awful lot of things that we used to do outside of a market relationship are now done through market relations. You know, if you're lonely, maybe rather than going down to the local over 55s dance club, you pick up a premium phone line and pay someone to chat to you. Or if you have a dog and you want to walk the dog, but you know, time is of the essence, you hire someone to walk your dog. But in a sense, that is a withdrawal, if you like, from public space. The third threat that I see comes from technology. And I found it very interesting that you were all told to switch, sorry, not to switch off your phones, but to put them to silent so you could maintain a relationship with others while I'm trying to keep your attention, right? So technology, I think, can be quite invasive in terms of creating a public realm. Now, I think the impact of those three processes, privatization, marketization, and technology, is that they push us towards a withdrawal from the public, or what I would describe as civic disaffiliation, right? They encourage us to disaffiliate. And I'm interested in how we become affiliated with others. And there is a kind of a continuum which operates, I think, in public space and in the city. One of those is spaces of collective identification. About 100 years ago, Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist, wrote about religion. And he caused a lot of controversy because he said, look, religion doesn't exist other than as a projection of ourselves onto something to make us, to help us to understand the nature of being social and to celebrate that sociality. And so Durkheim argued that, you know, we create these amazing rituals where we all get to engage in this fabulous process that he called collective effervescence, right? Which traditionally really was exercised through religion and religious practice. But you think about it today, where do we go for our collective effervescence? We go to rock concerts, we go to rugby matches, we go to Croke Park. And that gives us a tremendous sense of identification with others, of being, of oneness with others. But there's a problem with that, because there are costs associated. It's not completely open, it's not completely accessible, it's expensive to go to a rock concert. And the other thing is, of course, that you can always disaffiliate by just watching it at home or watching it on your phone, right? So you don't actually have to be there, because that experience can be mediated to you through technology. A second way that we connect with others is through place affiliation. And I came up with this idea because myself and some colleagues did research on the Irish suburbs a few years ago. And one of the reasons we did it was because people, commentators, particularly some whom I won't mention in the Irish Times, were slagging off suburbia and saying it was either a social desert or a valley of the squinting windows. And we kind of thought, well, you know, which is it? Or is either of those hypotheses right? So we researched 4 suburbs in the hinterland of Dublin: Ratoath, Leixlip, Mullingar, I know it's not in Dublin, but it's a dormitory suburb, and Lucan Esker. And what we were interested in was seeing, do people connect to each other in these suburbs? And we found that most people on average had 5 to 6 people in their own little network upon whom they could rely for support. So what that really showed was that these places were not places of intimacy between known others, but rather with kind of affiliative relations, that people knew there were people around them they could call to for help, but they didn't have to have an intense encounters with them. And, sorry, train of thought has just suddenly disappeared. So with suburbia then, sorry, the interesting thing about that was that in 4 different suburbs, everyone has 5 to 6 relations which are significant to them, but who are the people in those were different across the different suburbs. So in some it was friends, in others it was neighbours, and some it was family. So it shows the complexity, if you like, of how people construct these relations of affiliations. Now again, suburbia has a special kind of feel to it. Children are really important in suburbia and they create circuits of sociability. If you don't have kids, then perhaps you're a bit excluded. Now, so that's 2 different ways of being, but they both have sort of drawbacks. The third one, and the one I'm really interested in, is the chance encounters with unknown others. And this is really what Richard Sennett was talking about. Places where strangers meet and where we can tolerate each other and tolerate each other's strangeness. And these are, I think, places that are open to all, that are accessible, no requirements on entry, and they do not exclude. You can think of lots of these spaces in the context of Dublin. One of my favourites is the 40-foot. If you go to the 40-foot, you meet all of human life, all shapes and sizes, all colour tones, skin colour tones. And there's a wonderful kind of camaraderie that develops there between people who are complete strangers to each other and just happen to be into self-flagellation. Another example are public libraries, which I think are the jewel in the public services in our city, the jewel in the crown of the public services in our city, perhaps the only jewel. A senior guard once told me a few years ago that the most integrated space in the city of Dublin is the Blanchardstown Public Library. That is where you go if you want to meet a range of different people. But there are also other things like car boot sales and my own favourite, allotments. I have been doing research with some colleagues over the last few years on allotment gardening, both in Ireland and in Europe. And I think most of you will probably have noticed that these have really flourished in recent times. And I think what's interesting about allotments is that it isn't just about the digging and the food provisioning and food security. When we talk to people who go there, it's very much about connectedness to others. Again, not necessarily knowing someone's first name or even last name, but it happens to be somebody down the end of the row who gave them a couple of turnips to plant in return for which they gave them the beetroot. These are circuits of knowledge, circuits of production going on there that really give people a sense of connectedness to others. And particularly if you look in the ones in Dublin, they're very much about social levelling, about people leaving their baggage of class, gender, race, ethnicity at the gate of the allotment and dealing with each other in that public realm simply as strangers and others. In Belfast, we found the same thing, that ethno-religious divisions are actually bracketed. People don't talk politics in these spaces because they're relating to each other purely around the cultivation. So my big idea is that we need to encourage and seek out these kinds of spaces of potential in the city. We need to nurture them, and I think we need to create more of them. Because why? They teach us about civility, they teach us about sociability. And both of those things encourage us to inhabit our public selves, to be public citizens, and also to be public stewards, to take on the stewardship of our city because we inhabit it. And that, I think, produces civil integration, which guards against the problem I mentioned at the outset, civil disaffiliation. Thank you for your attention.